Ready. Fight! Dixon drew his blade as the infuriated soldier sprinted towards him. He poised the knife before swinging for the sergeant, missing Bishop. He tackled Dixon to the ground before holding Dixon by his throat with one arm and holding the knife with the other. Bishop roared as he smashed Dixon's hand against the nearby rock, doing everything to disarm him. Dixon began to lose consciousness as Bishop's grip grew tighter and tighter. After shaking his head, Dixon growled before jabbing his thumb into Bishop's shoulder wound. The injured sergeant screamed in agony as he felt Dixon's thumb under his flesh, twisting and churning his muscles and tendons. Bishop then tightened his grip around Dixon's wrist until, crack! Dixon wailed before pressing his hand deeper into Bishop's shoulder. He let go of the knife as the sergeant straddling him could no longer stand the excruciating pain. Bishop jumped onto his feet, clenching his shoulder as blood began to pour out of his wound. Dixon climbed onto his feet before throwing himself at Bishop. His superior weight and strength made it impossible to overpower the madman as he grabbed Bishop in a sleeper hold. Bishop choked, looking everywhere to find some kind of weapon. He threw his legs up before pushing against a tree, throwing them both onto the ground. As Bishop and Dixon landed in a large puddle, Bishop caught a glimpse of the knife in the distance. He reached out to it, millimeters from his grasp. Bishop kicked his legs in the air, desperately trying to move these precious extra millimeters towards the blade. Dixon laughed maniacally as Bishop finally grabbed the blade in his hand. Without any hesitation, he drove it into Dixon's thigh. The soldier winced, but kept his grip. Bishop then yanked the knife out again and stabbed 2 more times in the same exact spot before Dixon threw the sergeant off. Bishop gasped for air, crawling away from Dixon as fast as he could before he found himself being dragged back. Out of instinct, Bishop threw himself onto his back, turning just in time to stab Dixon firmly in the shoulder. Instantly, the crazed madman released his grip, grunting and playing before recoiling, with a long blade sticking out of his shoulder. Dixon slowly grabbed the bloody knife before using all of his strength to firmly tug on the blade, before realizing it was firmly lodged in his collarbone. This didn't so much as even discourage the lunatic before he dove at the sergeant again. Bishop kicked furiously at Dixon's face as the sergeant tried to get a grip on him. Dixon then grabbed Bishop's leg as he was kicked in the face once again. Bishop saw Dixon beginning to pull towards the firearm by the tree. Bishop looked at the ground before he grabbed hold of the tree. Dixon paused before kicking Bishop in the face with all of his might. Bishop's body went limp. Dixon grinned before turning to the sergeant, before flipping his body onto his stomach. Sergeant Dixon then pressed his shoe into Bishop's shoulder, making the sergeant scream as he grabbed Bishop's left arm and his right. Bishop saw what was coming, but there was nothing he could do to stop it. He braced himself before Dixon heaved, using all his body weight to dislocate Bishop's shoulder. The entire forest was rocked with the screams of the sergeant as Dixon slowly bent the sergeant's arm across his back. Adrenaline sending his mind into frenzy, Bishop kicked his leg upwards, striking Dixon in the groin. Bishop ripped his arm from the sergeant's grasp before running to a nearby tree. Leaning against it, he looked back at Dixon, who was now staring at him with venom in his eyes. Bishop used his good arm to push himself off the tree. "What you waiting for?" Bishop yelled, tears dripping from his eyes as the rain grew heavier. "I'm right here, you bitch!" With that, Dixon sprinted towards the taunting sergeant. Bishop braced himself before lifting his leg. Where Dixon was only moments away from striking him, Bishop used all his remaining strength to stomp on Dixon's knee. The perfectly timed blow sent a deafening crack through the woods. Dixon came once again screaming as he fell to the ground immobilized. Bishop stared down at Dixon as the sergeant turned to his back, looking down at his leg, which had been mangled beyond recognition. Dixon then looked at the sergeant towering over him before he attempted to reach for Bishop's leg as he grunted, "Fuck you!" Bishop responded by stomping on the blade lodged in Sergeant Dixon's shoulder, diving the sharp blade all the way through his shoulder. Dixon screamed again as Bishop watched more slowly, looking up at Dixon's handiwork. Breathing heavily, his hands shaking as the pain in his arm was becoming unbearable. He then looked at Private Andy, seeing the blood dripping out of his mouth. Bishop then gasped, "Dash!" His arm swung loosely as he ran towards the blue Pegasus. Dixon was wailing in agony as he kneeled by her side. Seeing the blood pouring into the puddle, Bishop mustered all his will and used both arms to pull her out of the water. The sergeant opened her eyes, seeing that they were lifeless, before looking at her lacerated ribcage. He looked in relief and saw her chest moving up and down. She was alive, but only just. Leaning over her, the sergeant began to bawl. He looked up again at Andy. Time seemed to slow down, as the torturing grief began pounding in his chest. Realizing the situation he was in, the heartache, though, quickly subsided when he heard Dixon laughing, to which Bishop stormed towards the pistol, grabbed it in his right hand, before marching back to Dixon. Unadulterated rage would be a considerable understatement to how Bishop felt right now. Dixon looked up, only to be presented with Bishop's shoe as he kicked the downed sergeant in the face. Dixon continued to laugh despite the onslaught. Bishop stopped, pointing the pistol at Dixon's face as the cocky grin continued to grin. You won't do it. You don't have the gumption. You spineless fuck. Bishop paused, staring down at the sergeant through the sights of the Colt 45. He tightened his grip, taking a deep breath. Click, click, click. The gun was empty. Bishop checked the weapon before Dixon began to laugh once again. Looks like, Dixon grunted between breaths. Looks like fate's on my side. Fuck! Bishop scowled before stomping on the blade lodged in his shoulder again. The sergeant growled as he straddled Dixon's chest, flipping the gun until he was holding the barrel in his hand. Look at me! Bishop roared. Look at me, you miserable fuck! Because I'll be the last thing you'll fucking see! With that, Bishop struck Dixon across the face with his pistol. Dixon spat out a tooth and some blood before turning to look Bishop in the eyes. Is that all you've got? You hit like a faggot! Bishop's mind went blank with hate as he struck Dixon across the face again and again and again and again. Bishop repeatedly began to hit the wounded sergeant, each blow slowly getting faster and stronger as blood began to spatter all over him. He began to cry out in pain with every blow he delivered. His arm began to burn until he could no longer move it. Bishop stood up, gasping for air as he looked down at Dixon. His face was completely covered in blood. The only signs of life were the faint gurgles emitting from the sergeant's throat. Bishop brought his leg up before finishing the job. With every step the sergeant took, it brought him closer to his freedom. He limped through the forest, the bag on his back, the crucially injured Pegasus's head stuck out on top of it, allowing her to breathe normally. Bishop grabbed everything he could with his good arm before setting off. Ammo, knives, food, everything he could find. He was now on his own, in the woods, his left arm hanging loosely as he staggered through the rain. Every so often, he'd reach back and feel Dash's temperature. The wooden sergeant's mind was blank, with only one mission in his powering his fatigued body. His brutal suffering with Dixon had jolted the shrapnel under his flesh, creating twice as much pain then, before crashing, causing the wounds to bleed profusely, leaving a crimson trail behind him. He was growing weak. He started to pick up the pace, until he found his vision slowly growing darker. His heart started to race as he ran faster than before seeing something through the trees. He continued his pace, checking to see again if Rainbow Dash was still breathing. He stumbled upon what looks like a civilization, a town in the distance. Not only that, he saw people walking around. He was finally out of the damn forest, and now he was in the clear. He laughed to himself in joy, running as fast as he could into the field separating the forest from town. Hey! He screamed at the top of his lungs. In the distance, a woman looked at him. Bishop screamed again, running on the large field into the open. The woman called to her friends, pointing at him. The sergeant slowed down, allowing himself to catch his breath before falling to his knees. He shook the bag off his shoulder, accidentally putting his dislocated arm in the process. He placed the bag in front of him, looking at the wounded Pegasus inside. At her eyes, they were bloodshot, as they looked up at him. Bishop stroked her face before she rested her head on his palm. Bishop smiled. Her body was still warm, but her breathing was weak, and he looked up to see a group of people running towards him. "It's okay. We're here. It's all over. It's all over." As soon as the residents ran up to him, he finally relaxed, letting himself collapse onto the ground, once again knocking his dislocated arm. The sergeant laid still. Ow. What happened? Rainbow Dash looked up, seeing the bright lights in the ceiling, hurting her eyes. She blinked, looking at herself. She covered almost head to hoof in bandages, with a nauseating throbbing feeling starting to pulse in her muzzle. She reached out to touch it before she yelped loudly. The sharp pain in her back stopped her from squirming. She looked at her surroundings. It was strange. The room she was in was almost exactly how she remembered the hospital in Ponyville. She was in a bed next to the window to her left, and there was a closed curtain in front of her, with a door with shadows rushing by it. The commotion outside was giving her a headache. She laid back down on the comfy bed, seeing the clock above her. Then she noticed something. She felt her bruised wings. There was nothing in her feathers. My element!" she exclaimed, trying to shuffle off the bed. The pain in her back restricted her movements. She yelled in pain again. She began to panic. What if someone stole it? What if I lost it? Is it in the forest? How will I get it back? Rainbow Dash jolted as a flashback exploded in her vision. Andy, the knife, that bloody knife, and Dixon's evil eyes looking into her soul before her head smashed against the floor. She felt her head, feeling the pain slowly getting worse and worse. Then she remembered seeing Bishop on the floor, pleading for Dixon to stop hurting her. She looked down, seeing the stitched-up laceration on her chest, which stretched as she breathed, causing her to wince with every breath she took. Her whole body was burning with pain. She leaned forward, trying not to cry, as her eyes were so sore. Just then, the curtains to her left opened. The sergeant was sitting in the bed next to her, and his face was black and blue, barely recognizable because it had swollen up so much. "Bish?" she said faintly, lifting a hoof towards him. The sergeant responded by standing up, before limping towards her bed. His left arm was in a cast, and his chest was completely mummified in bandages. He kneeled beside the bed, resting his arms on it as he looked at her. "Rise and shine," he smirked, passing it off as a bad joke. Rainbow Dash smiled back, before lying on her side, resting her head in his arms, still looking up at him. Bishop rested his hand on the only part of her body that wasn't bruised or cut. She snuggled closer to Bishop, feeling the warmth of his body once again. She closed her eyes as Bishop moved his hand to her mane, gently stroking it, calming her nerves, and making her feel safe once again. Bishop and Rainbow sat next to each other as they watched the commotion outside the door. Rainbow Dash was leaning against the sergeant, still unable to move freely. Where are we? Emden, Germany. This is where the injured civilians get medical attention. We were actually pretty lucky to get here before they really started to get busy. Bishop looked at the Pegasus to see a noticeable frown on her face. "Hey," he started. "What's wrong?" It's nothing." "Nothing, huh?" The soldier briefly glanced around him, before looking back at Rainbow Dash with a quizzical look on his face. "Rainbow, I want to ask you something." "What?" she said, still looking at the floor. Bishop stood up off the bed. Rainbow Dash started following him with her eyes. The sergeant went to his bedside table before opening a small drawer, before pulling out her golden necklace. Dash's eyes widened. My element! Where did you find it? It fell out of your wing when I was carrying you. Is there something you haven't told me? Yes. Bishop started walking back with the item in his hands, not breaking eye contact as she sat next to her on the hospital bed. Dash reached out with her hoof and took it out of his hands before holding it lightly against her chest. What? I know you didn't have it the first time we met. No. Bishop waited, following Dash to collect her thoughts. She slowly placed the element on the bed. When I was in Equestria, I was known as the Element of Loyalty. I was given this necklace because it was one of the 6 pieces of the elements of harmony. Bishop stayed quiet, raising an eyebrow, still listening to everything she was saying. The elements of harmony are the most powerful magic in the world of Equestria. Me and my friends use it to beat monsters, gods, and dark wizards. This probably sounds crazy to you, being in a world without magic. Trust me, to believe anything right now. I'm willing to believe anything right now. Who are your friends? Twilight, Applejack, Pinkie Pie, Rarity, and Fluttershy. And they're... like me, yes. The sergeant looked at this solid gold on the necklace, examining the markings, the red jewel, and the clip on the back. Does it mean something? When it was given to me, I was also given the title of being the element of loyalty. That's why I was gray when you saw me in the forest. When those guys were beating me, torturing me, I was actually about to give in and tell them where you were heading. Because I went against what I stood for. I was no longer serving my purpose in the world of being loyal to my friends. And that was when I turned gray. It was horrible. I got so angry. I even kicked that mustache guy in the nose. Mustache guy? Yeah, this guy with a weird mustache was shouting at me. He got angry because I laughed at it. Rainbow Dash heard Bishop snort. She looked up at the sergeant to see him covering his mouth before he started laughing hysterically. What's so funny? Oh my god. You know who you kicked in the face, right? Rainbow Dash looked blankly at the sergeant. Who? Never mind. You wouldn't know him. Tell me. Okay. Oh, my Celestia. The sergeant continued to laugh as Rainbow Dash looked at him in horror. Bishop tried to calm himself down, but he couldn't contain his amusement. Rainbow Dash shortly followed, laughing with Bishop. Oh my. Bishop chuckled. I would have paid to see that. That's hilarious. Slowly, minute by minute, the room got quieter, until they were stuck in the same silence as before. Soon, Bishop found his smile slowly fading as a thought crept to his mind. Rainbow, he started. The Pegasus turned to face him. You said your friends sent you that necklace, right? Does that mean you can go back? She paused briefly, looking at the ground. Bishop began to predict what her answer was going to be. Yes. If I put it on, I'll go home, she mumbled, shuffling her hooves. The sergeant then leant closer. You already know what I'm going to say next, don't you? I couldn't. I wanted to make sure you were safe. I couldn't leave this world knowing you were in danger. I'm sorry. You were mighty brave for coming back, knowing what was waiting for you. But it was stupid. I would have never forgiven myself if you died out there. I know. I know it was dumb, but I wanted to stay. Please don't be mad. Mad? I'm not mad. I'm happy how things turned out. You were very lucky, but that doesn't mean you're safe. Every second you're in this world, you're in danger. And if there's a way for you to go home, then it's only right for you to do so. Instead, you risking your life for something you don't need to go through. But I don't want to. Not yet. I'll be fine. I'm going to contact base from here. I'll get picked up and taken back to my country, where I'll be able to perform my duties again. Everything's going to be fine. For you, and for me. I'll make it easy for you. Bishop grabbed the element before opening it. Rainbow Dash started to tear up, as her bottom lip was quivering, as Bishop held the golden necklace. Looking at it, he took a deep breath as he brought it to Rainbow. The Pegasus started to wince as he got closer to her. She lifted a hoof, stopping Bishop from getting any closer. No, wait. Please, she said, tears welling up in her eyes. Come on. Don't make this any harder for me than it already is. I know I have to go back. I know. I just want an hour. One more hour. Please? Bishop stared into her eyes. She wore the most adorable puppy dog expression on her face, and it was working. The sergeant picked up the necklace and placed it to one side, before turning back to her. 1 hour, and you're going home. Rainbow Dash jumped forward, wrapping her hooves around him. Bishop felt his shoulder getting soaked as she openly cried into his neck. Thank you, she whispered. Bishop hesitated before returning the embrace, doing his best not to touch her bruises. The sergeant found himself fighting back his tears as he began to savor the last few minutes he'd be spending with her. Hey, Bish. Yeah? Before I go, can you do something for me? What? Rainbow Dash stepped back, looking at him, shuffling her hooves again. Can you read to me? Bishop paused again, one tear managing to escape his eye, rolling down his cheek as he smiled. Okay.